It does feel like in this moment, right? We had all of this huge uprising over the summer. We had more people engaged with a specific issue and in the streets willing to put their bodies on the line in the middle of a COVID crisis over this issue, which is drawing a great deal of sympathy, police killings of Black people. And it felt like there was a disconnect between the potential, the raw potential, the potential energy of that protest, and kind of what our so-called leaders in academia, people who didn't have as much at stake as politicians do, arguably, tenured professors, even didn't necessarily, I think, push forward a way to politicize and connect that to the ongoing primary in a way that I would have liked. And it feels to me in some ways that energy, it's not all over, but the energy was wasted, squandered in some ways.
Well, yeah, I mean, to even put it more in context, which I'm sure you've talked about on this, but paydayreport.com, they keep a lot of stats on strikes and things like that. And
Yeah.
So according to them, back in September, they had counted 900 mostly wildcat strikes from March to September, right? The biggest strike wave we've had in the United States since the 40s, right? You could count on one hand the number of outlets, whether they're mainstream or radical,
Yeah.
that push this fact. Now, some of those things were also not only were they militant in the fact that they're wildcat strikes, but some of them, like the one with the GE workers who said, no, we want to make ventilators. That was a qualitative difference in what they were doing, a radical difference in where people were going with that, right? Then you had stuff like the longshore workers who shut down the whole West Coast from Canada to Mexico in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, right? Now, and this, I mean, it was a one-day symbolic thing, right? But the hopes were for it to catch on and go forward. Now, there were some other little things, like in the Midwest, you had restaurants where people walked out where the workers walked out so that to stop the police discount and things like that. But even Tesla workers, in solidarity with the longshore workers, they walked out. And in the middle of trying to create a union and using that to walk out. So the amount of folks that were willing to talk about this and promote it, as opposed to, let's say, a demonstration in the street against Black Lives Matter, that really dwindled. And I'll tell you this, I purposely was emailing and DMing folks to try to get them to talk about it.
Yeah.
But for some reason, well, it's not just for some reason, but it is something that has that doesn't seem as glamorous, or maybe not as radical, because the formal unions, which are only 7% of the working class, have been taken over by liberals for so long. So even radicals are like, oh, how does this work? And that's because we haven't been doing our job at talking, like, how do you put forward class analysis in a real way if left out of that is the fact that the class struggle, which is centered around the ability to withhold labor collectively. If people don't understand that, then we haven't been putting out those ideas correctly. And I'm saying I've been part of it, like, it's taken me a while to get to this particular idea, in that, like, I've been part of things where we've had 15, 20,000 people out to stop a certain thing. And a lot of those folks are brand new, right? And they come out and they're like, wow, I'm here. This is amazing. Look at all these people. Now what do we do?
Yeah.
And we're like,
Yeah,
I
that's
don't
how
know.
I feel.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Lift every voice, you know?
Yeah.
And the truth is because here, and I've said this before, but maybe, and so sometimes I feel try to stop saying it because I've said it so many times, but I'll say it
No,
here
you got
because
to say
maybe
it. That's the lesson I learned from Bernie. You got to say it every day for 40 years before it kicks in.
so many of us look at the I'll say this: the left has avoided the class struggle for the last 60 years. And I'm talking about not just the liberals, not just the progressives, the radical left itself as well has avoided the class struggle for the last 60 years. And to discuss that, you got to go back so since the 60s, since the beginning of the new left. And to discuss why that happened, you have to go back before that. In the 20s and 30s, according to Julia Reichardt's documentary, and I've seen other things that say it too, in the 20s and 30s, there were 1 million card-carrying communists in the United States at a time when the population of the United States was only 120 million, right? And so you think about those 1 million and what that affect, and then all the friends and family and things like that. So there's a big effect. During that same time, the 20s and 30s, there were places like Alabama, Montana, Utah, Oklahoma. Those places were considered hotbeds of communist activity by the FBI.
Utah.
Right? Utah, especially. I mean, and so there were things like mining strike on top of this, like outwardly radical viewpoint that these struggles were having. They were based in jobs, and people were doing things like there were strikes going on all over the mines, and you had places like the Midwest, occupying factories and taking it over, and in Alabama and in Oklahoma, people like shooting it out with corporate guards and things like that, and this was, of course, there was the regular trade union movement that was, not that as radical, but then there was also a big part of it that was doing this with a radical vision. And when you look at books like Hosea Hudson, Life of a Negro Communist in Alabama, we see that it wasn't just the white working class as well.
Right.
We see that like he says that he was in the Communist Party for 2 years before he realized that, and meeting a lot of people before he realized there were white communists.
Yeah.
And then we had even movements like the Marcus Garvey movement, which the cadre of the Marcus Garvey movement were all people from the African Blood Brotherhood who were part of the Communist Party. So we had this thing happening, and you'd have demonstrations in the streets of 20,000, 30,000 people and it was truly a demonstration in the sense that it demonstrated something else. It said, here's 20, 30,000 people that will shut down your industry, shut down this industry, shut down that industry. So it was demonstrating actual power, and the power that it was demonstrating came from the ability to shut down industry. And in that, and at the same time, obviously there were revolutions that had just happened all over the world and were in the midst of happening. And then you had stuff happen, like the bonus march that was separate from maybe the most separate from that activity, but still there were militant things where they were marching to the White House, and some of them were armed, and these were military veterans wanting their bonus pay, right? And marching to the White House, many of them armed and being met by General MacArthur with tanks. So this is what was happening in the U.S. that caused there to be the New Deal. It wasn't just from getting FDR into office,
Right.
right? It wasn't, if you can shut down industry, you can make any politician do what you want them to do,
Yeah.
right? Because that's who they're there serving, right? So, but we go from that period to the period that was called for by the leaders of the Comintern, which was the United Front Against Fascism, and that took many forms. But the whole point of it was, for all these powers to unite to defeat Hitler. And the form that was called for it to take in the United States was that that communists, radicals in the United States, needed to not threaten during this time to openly call for overthrowing the government, right? And so that was part of the United Front Against Fascism. U.S. is going to go defeat Hitler. Radicals aren't going to say, while that's happening, we're going to overthrow the government here, right? And so that called for going underground.
So yet
And so
another thing on Hitler's long rap sheet that we can blame him for is the end of radicalism in the United States.
Well, I won't say it was the end of they took a different tact, which which was that they were now progressives, right?
I
They were
see.
now like organizing but not calling for this thing, and so that went on for a good 15 years. And again, things I'm saying, I'm essentializing, I'm leaving out a lot of contradictory things, but there's a storyline here that
Right.
kind of has so by the time House American Activities Committee comes around, they're able to point at a lot of these same people who had the same group of folks who had 15, 18 years before been community leaders and labor leaders with an outward open call for revolution, who were now replaced by folks who believed in that same thing, but now were, saying, I'm just a progressive and I just want to see these small changes. So the House Un-American Activities Committee were able to point at them and say, they're not who they say they are. They're revolutionaries. They're communists. And, and insinuated is like they've been lying about themselves. So obviously it's something to not trust.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but had they done that 15 years before, people would be like, I know they're communists. That's why I like them, because they helped me and my family move my furniture in when we were being evicted. Right.
Yeah.
And so because of House Un-American Activities Committee and McCarthyism and all of that, combined with the critiques of what happened during Stalin's time and the Communist Party's reaction and non-reaction to that, though that the biggest radical organization in the United States broke up into all these little tiny groups that became what we know as the New Left. And the New Left took on a different tact, different than the time before them, which was to say outwardly, fuck you, I'm a communist. Fuck you, I'm a radical. Matter of fact, the way that the House Un-American Activity Committee was able to be to be stopped was when they came to San Francisco. Radicals went in there and literally said, fuck you, I'm a communist. And it became a big rally. And they decided they didn't want this to be a rallying point to make, being communist cool. So, and that was the end of that. And also kind of the beginning of the New Left in the Bay Area that had ripples all over the place. But anyway, the New Left said, fuck you, I'm a communist. Fuck you, I'm a radical. And at the same time, because of being purged from the formal unions that they had created, they also left organizing in the workplace and left those areas, left Montana, left Utah, left and moved to big cities. Like literally that was the campaign. Move to these big cities and focus on and a big focus was students. So, but how do you organize students? How do you organize a strike with students? You can do it and it would be called a strike, but it's a different relationship, right?
Yeah.
It's a more of a symbolic thing. And because of not organizing in the working class, obviously, like I said, there's things like where people did try to organize radicals. Some did do that, but for the most part, that was happening, and all of a sudden you started having demonstrations be the be all end all. Like the demonstration is the point where we have people out in the street. Getting in the streets is the be all end all. And that was also the first time you heard the students are the revolution. It had no historical actual thing. Like, not that students hadn't been involved in revolutions, but the idea of this new movement that the students are the revolution, the only connection it had to truth was the Cultural Revolution, which was happening at the same time. But other than that, it wasn't it wasn't true. So then you have a different model, which is we're going to create spectacle. We're going to try to use the media in certain ways and create this thing that's kind of this. Then when you subtract the actual organizing around exploitation of labor from it, then it becomes even more amorphous what you're actually fighting for, right? What these things are.